So I filled up three of those books. I think the page there must be at least 150 pages per book. So I was gathering information all the time. So anyway, I made it into a profession because I realized I couldn't support this weird hobby on its own. If I was going to make a living doing something else, I would not have the time to continue to study astrology. So anyway, but in the late 90s, I met I would say a leading microbiologist. Her name was Lynn Margulis, and we met at a book signing. I had written hiking guides. I always had hiking and outdoor activities as a major hobby, and I wrote about them. But she recruited me for her program. She taught at UMass and required me to get a PhD, which I did. And I worked with her for about 15 years. And then unfortunately, she died of a stroke and in 2014, I think. And that time that I spent with her brought me right into the scientific community. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I started in science with astronomy and paleontology. And when I first went to college at Rutgers, geology was my major. And I dropped out for a few years after encountering astrology. And when I went back and finally got a BA, it was in history with a minor in philosophy. So you could see there was a big change in my thinking. I was really trying to understand how things worked. But anyway, 15 years with Lynn Margulis, attended a number of scientific conferences, wrote some papers, taught the whole time, was assisting her in teaching her course or teaching it when she was away. She took a year off to teach at Oxford. And so I became very acquainted with how science works and science in academia in particular. And this was good information because it allowed me to see astrology in a much broader perspective. During that time in science, very few people were expressed any interest in what I did. I mean, as soon as they heard the word astrology, like the door closed. But there were a few that would come up to me in private and say, "Yeah, I'm studying astrology on my own, but don't tell anybody." So I do know for a fact that there are a few closet astrologers in the scientific community, and what they do is they tend to approach it on their own terms. They read a couple books and then they got their own ideas and they run with those. So they're not really part of the astrological community. They're just independent researchers. So as a result of that kind of unusual path, I've come to some views on astrology, what it is, and what the astrological community might want to do if it wants to get a little bit more serious about itself.
Yes, and your latest book, you get into a lot of detail about, concepts like self-organizing systems and, potential avenues of exploration from that perspective. I wanted to ask another follow-up question because I want to kind of bring forth the side of you that was so intrigued, despite your kind of education and the mindset that you were living in. Something was striking enough about astrology and how it worked, like the level of accuracy that you were seeing, that made you want to delve into it despite the resistances around you. Could you tell us more about, you mentioned that, you started looking at your own chart and secondary progressions and also charts of your acquaintances, and something was just really working well about it. What kinds of things were you seeing that led you to feel that way?
Well, it was very clear. I had all these charts of my friends, and I was always playing in bands, so I had charts of people that I would see every week, or several times a week. I could kind of follow them. I had girlfriends, and I would watch how the transits would affect them, and the secondary progressions. And later on, I added solar arcs. Very early, I had a copy of Alan Leo's book on astrological calculations. I forget what the name of it is, but he had primary directions and everything there. And I tried out all these different astrological techniques, but I settled on transits and secondaries as the most useful. And later on, I added solar arcs and so on. when I studied Uranian astrology. That was, I should mention that I was very involved in Uranian astrology in the 70s and 80s and continue to be. So I'm well versed in that. And I was also always interested in the history of astrology. In the 70s, I was reading Ptolemy and Manilius, and then later translations occurred, Dorotheus and so on. But so I was very interested in ancient astrology from probably the mid to late 70s on, and still am. So, I have a broad base. I'm not coming from any one single school of astrology. I would consider myself an eclectic astrologer. But to answer your question, if you're a good observer, and an observer has to be detached, and I've come to understand that a lot of people just they don't have it, or it doesn't come to them very easily. It's like anything else. Some people can paint a picture, and some people can't. I mean, you can learn. Some people have it, as somebody I know once said, some got it, some don't. Well, yes and no. I think that the idea of the blank slate is a little overblown. We don't come in as blank slates. I mean, we have genetic differences and we have environmental differences, and they make us very different. But the genetic differences, you can't rule them out. You can see it operating all the time. Anyway, for whatever reason, I have, I think, a natural ability, an innate ability to objectify myself, to detach myself. I think that's seen in an Aquarius moon. You'll see that with a lot of people that have a strong Aquarius or strong Uranus. I have a very strong Uranus as well. So I was able to pull myself back and watch what's going on with other people and myself, to detach my observing mind from myself. So that's all I needed to do to convince myself that astrology works. But to me, one of the most incredible discoveries has been that there are a lot of people I've run into, particularly in philosophy and physics and science, particularly physics, that have a great deal of difficulty in doing that, because they're so embedded in the mind patterns that they learned to do their subject. And of course, both of them have an incredible resistance to anything that tends to disrupt a kind of a physicalist view of the world. And I'm not saying that they're wrong. Don't quote me on that. I am a person who has studied philosophy for a very long time, and I really don't have any fixed, rigid position, when it comes to how the whole thing that we're in works. And I tend to agree with Colin McGinn, who's a philosopher, who said that the human mind is not constructed in a way to be able to understand what consciousness is. So I'm kind of, I'm not on one boat or the other. I'm even in that way, I'm an observer.
I really want to get to the topic of consciousness, but I'm trying to be patient. So what I hear from what you're saying, and it makes a lot of sense with the Uranus and Aquarius emphasis in your chart. It was kind of intuitively matter of fact to you that it works. You didn't have to kind of come to elaborate explanations about why. It was just clear to you, is what I'm hearing. Am I understanding correctly?
Well, there's a difference between correlation and causation.
Mm-hmm.
And, what I observed were correlations. The causation part is that's the biggest problem for astrology. There is no known accepted causation explanation for astrology. There are theories, hypotheses. Some of them have been slightly tested, but not much. So we really don't know exactly how this works. But the correlation is strong, and there are good studies that show correlations. For my PhD, I did a correlation between the sun and Saturn and Earth and cold temperatures in certain regions of the planet, and particularly in the Northeast where I live and in Europe. And you see the sun goes opposite Saturn and it gets cold there. And you do that over and over again, for 100 years, 150 years, 200 years, and you get the same results. What do you make of that? I mean, I have Physical hypothesis is that the effect tends to get amplified when the sun and Saturn are near the equinoxes. And so that would be a gravitational influence at 90 degrees to the actual Earth poles. That would be the poles of the equator. And that gravitational effect could flatten the atmosphere. And like a gravitational tide, it could push cold air cells or cold air masses further south. That's a hypothesis. I don't know the answer to it.
Yes, and you have said that, again, your latest book is kind of like a culmination of everything that you've deliberated about the question and where you've arrived at so far, kind of a thing.
It outlines the problem. I should say that astrology was traditionally divided into two categories, which today would be called, say, natal astrology, people's charts of people, and natural astrology, which would have to do with things like the weather and the changes and developments that go on in societies of people and agricultural trends, agricultural events. So there's the nature side of astrology and there's the human personal side of astrology. And within that, this second category, the natal astrology, you could also kind of talk about things like electional astrology and horary. They're mostly related to people. But what I'm saying in my book is that all kinds of astrology are related to what are called self-organizing systems. And a self-organizing system is a collection of things that is held together by multiple feedback loops and becomes an entity in its own right. It's, the best way to think about it is like a school of fish or a swarm of birds. You ever see those, what are they called? Mermations of starlings, where they're flying and they suddenly coalesce and then they move around. That's self-organizing. And so is a cell. A cell is a bunch of molecules that self-organize in a way such that the cell sustains itself. And the same thing is true of a hurricane, where you have conditions, you have a low pressure area, and then suddenly, well, maybe not so suddenly, but it gets enough conditions, environmental conditions like a warm base, a warm ocean under it, that tend to accelerate the motions of the air. And suddenly there's a vortex forms, and you have like a cell. They call it a cell, right? So you have that in nature. And a human being or any animal for that matter, is a collection of cells that are self-organizing. And then we have our brain is doing something, and it's organized. The information is being organized in a way so that we develop a sense of self. And then human beings communicate with each other, and all these communications amount to some sort of self-organizing system. The simplest example would be the stock market. So you have millions of people buying and selling stocks, but there's a behavior that emerges from it. It's called emergent behavior, or emergence. And the stock market can be tracked with astrology, because we know people, I'm sure you do, that make a living tracking the stock market with astrology, right? There's quite a few of them out there. Yes. So that's a self-organizing system too. So is a country, or so is a baseball team. When you have a lot of people in a room, there tends to be a kind of organization occurs. So astrology, as I see it, and what I describe in my book from many different angles, as well as how astrology, got to be where it is today, which is not a very good place. In terms of having anything to say in the world, or being able to contribute to the global conversation. That's what I mean. But the book describes, what sort of self-organizing systems are and how astrology relates to them.
Yes, so this is a very crucial topic, and I want to get into it further. So when you talk about self-organizing systems, it all makes sense to me. but it falls into my category of consciousness, which you have expressed that you prefer to stay agnostic about because it's such a hefty topic. It's been debated and discussed for centuries, if not millennia. And it's, you want to just be open, but not take any specific stance about it. Which let's just agree on what we agree on, which is that can we agree on the concept of intelligence? Because what you're describing also is a form of intelligence where whether it's nature in the form of plants or animals or larger systems created by humans like the financial system, all of it seems to be run or guided by some unifying factor is kind of what I'm collapsing what you're saying into. If we can agree on that and call it at least some form of natural principle or intelligence, then we could maybe go to the next stage of asking how science is approaching that on a larger scale, not just in terms of what it's studying in like a limited category, but like as a general worldview. If I don't know if I conveyed what I'm trying to, but
Let's start with the definition of intelligence. How do you define intelligence?
good question. So I think I would say that intelligence has to do with adapting. It has to do with optimization and efficiency and the constant process of going towards more of those things. So intelligence uses information and experience to go towards, let's say, better and better in the form of efficiency, optimization, getting better results, and including more. So it increases its complexity over time. So it's really a process, I would say, of how information is worked or evolves over time.
Well, would you say it's a property of self-organizing systems?
That's how I see it, but I would want to know how you put
Well,
those two.
that's how I would see it. If
Yes.
with that definition, self-organizing systems have these properties that optimize situations, and they stabilize themselves, but they are also very sensitive to their environment and will evolve. And in the case of higher organisms, so-called higher organisms, it's very obvious. So yeah, intelligence could be used as a property of self-organizing systems.
Okay. So if we agree on that, and let's kind of shift the conversation to science then, because my main, I don't want to call it issue, but my main kind of focus in this discussion has always been where science is at in terms of understanding and being able to describe that larger intelligence, because self-organizing systems, you can look at, each one of the categories, like, again, let's say a specific species of animal or plant, that has a self-organizing system within it. But then also, as you described, there are self-organizing systems in terms of how those relate with each other, like animals are attuned to plants in certain ways, and there's the circadian rhythms and all of that. It's all kind of intertwined. So my issue, that now I'm going to use the term issue, with the scientific paradigm as it is right now, or has been, is that there's no satisfactory description or detailed description or even attempt to describe that level of operation in nature or in reality, really. Because as we're saying, it applies to everything, not just nature. It's kind of the stuff of how everything works. So I have issue with science as it is. I was wondering where you stand with it, because you've encountered a lot of resistance, and astrology in general has been in this kind of dynamic where it's trying to prove its existence or its validity within the scientific culture that it was existing in. But I see the problem more as where science was at, as I've said before in my presentation. How do you view that whole, what I'm describing as an issue?
Well, the first thing we need to do is be clear about what you mean by science.
Okay.
So, what I'm assuming you mean is the science that we mostly hear about, in the media, and that generally is the one that gets the grants and that's reductionist science. And it's mostly driven by physics. And so we hear a lot about it. It gets the most money, and so that it could do the most research. And it has a physicalist or materialist perspective on the world. I mean, the physicists believe, a lot of them will say that eventually everything's going to be physics because you can predict everything. Once you know you learn everything. But I would add that while that's going on, there's a whole lot of other science that's going on. People are using the scientific method and they're investigating things like consciousness, and you don't see them much. Now, to use an analogy, right? I've been a musician all my life, as on the side, on the back burner, part time. And there are acts and performers and artists that are very well known. And you hear about them all the time. And they make a lot of money. But I know from my experience, there are some very good and interesting musicians, especially in jazz, for example, and experimental jazz, that don't get heard. And they're out there, and there are many of them, perhaps more than the ones that are making the big time and getting all the attention. So what I would point out is that we got to be careful when we talk about, use the word science loosely. We need to be more specific. I would say something like establishment, reductionist, materialist, mechanistic science, which is what I use in the book. That's the term, RMM. But
okay.
That's true. I mean, in that format, science has a very difficult time with astrology. It has, and besides that, it has no interest in astrology because how are you going to make money with it? They don't see any way, any practical value in it, and the tests that have been done, in their opinion, don't prove it. And most of the tests are looking for some kind of mechanism. Some aren't. I should bring up some examples.
Yes.
There's the Shawn Carlson test. You know about that one? Okay. So Shawn Carlson was a graduate student of a physicist, whose name escapes me right now, but I'm very familiar with his work. He was an astrophysicist. And he decided to test the astrological hypothesis that a person could read a birth chart and know something about somebody. So what he does is he gets a bunch of students, right? So these are people that are not very old and they're not really fully, matured individuals. I mean, how deep their self-knowledge is the first question I would ask, right? People don't know who they are. I mean, there's plenty of people that are much older that don't know who they are. Anyway, so he gets these people and he gives them a California personality inventory test, which is, like the MMPI and the ISANC, and there are a number of these tests. Like they're on paper, they were on paper, and you get questions, and you just basically describe yourself. So it's a self-generated, psychological profile. Then he takes their birth charts and he gives them to a group of astrologers and asks them to write out a description of the chart and what that person might be like. I happen to have been one of those astrologers back then. I was young. I was like probably 25 or something when I did it.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. But I still have the files from it in my cabin. I haven't gotten to throwing them out yet. I don't know if I will. Maybe, probably. Everything's got to go. But I found this to be ridiculous. He's asking us to write out, do this written horoscope. It takes a lot of time. Then what he does is he compares them. He gives them to the students to see which one, which of the charts match, who they think they are. And there are a couple other variations that he goes through. But basically, it was like comparing apples to oranges. The California personality inventory draws out certain behavior characteristics. An astrological chart, as you would know, or anybody who knows anything about astrology would know, talks about a lot more than behavior. It talks about predisposition. And sometimes predisposition isn't apparent in the short term, it's apparent only over the course of a life. So it's like apples and oranges. Anyway, so that's what he did. Then he decides that, okay, the astrologers did worse than chance. He publishes the paper and it's in Nature. Now, there are two big scientific publications in the world, Nature from England and Science from the United States. And if you get your paper in one of those two, you get a lot of readers. Yeah. And so his paper is cited over and over and over again. It's a piece of garbage, and people have looked at it. Ken Ritchie's looked at it and taken it apart and shown how the statistics were flawed. And I've complained about it in the way I just did. Other people have, but it's embedded in the scientific, the reductionist, mechanistic, materialistic, dominant form of science in the world today. And there are other examples of this, but this is just one. So you get a bad study like that, it gets, in my opinion, and a lot of other people's opinion, it gets published in a prestigious magazine, and so it gets quoted. And so people take it for granted. Now, this is something very interesting that I had to deal with when I was writing my PhD thesis, because I did it on astrology. A lot of what's in my book is from my PhD thesis, but I had one of my advisors was a historian of science, and who was kind of an expert on Renaissance science, a very interesting guy. But he got me to read about a book about Robert Boyle, and it was written by Stephen Shapin. And what the author was arguing in that book is that science is this developed in the 17th century to be this respectability game. And so if you're a respectable person, you have credibility. Now, Boyle happened to be a rich kid that could devote his whole life to doing chemistry. And even though he was interested in astrology and he hung out with astrologers, we don't know about that. That's kept under wraps, right? But he published, and he was very influential and very well-known scientist. And there are things like Boyle's law. He studied gases and chemistry and some pumps, that sort of thing. But it's about respectability. So what happens is when you ask somebody, say when I was at University of Massachusetts and I was teaching there, and I would talk to somebody and they would ask some questions about me, and I would say I was interested in did astrology. They would and they would stop, and I said, well, I see you know a lot about it. And then I said, where did you hear that it was wrong? Well, everybody knows that. I said, well, exactly where did you hear it? But so I would try to force them into tracing it back. And my advisor, the one that kind of brought me into that fold, Lynn Margulis, loved this game because she would do it all the time. She would wait for somebody to get a knee-jerk reaction to astrology and then start asking them how much they actually knew. Uh-huh. And no, they wouldn't know anything about it. Now, just to be clear, Lynn Margulis was never into astrology. She was too busy with microbiology. She was working on the origin of the nucleus. But she recognized the way I was thinking and what I was doing, and she liked it, and she saw how other people were too quick to just go take the follow the crowd basically and go along with the program. So there's this factor that's not scientific in the least, and it says more about us as a species, where once something becomes respectable, it's hard to dislodge it from that, and people will line up behind it and create problems for anything else that's in the way.
You brought up two very important pieces, I feel. The first one is obviously that, the collective is a huge complex system, and we have much more going on than what's visible in the mainstream. So mainstream science might be a certain way, but there's all sorts of things going on otherwise. It's just a matter of it getting the spotlight or being heard by the masses. And that's an important piece. And then the second thing that you mentioned, as you were talking about your the experience with the having to assess for that study, is that psychology and the actual sciences that are responsible for describing human emotions and behavior are not at a place. There's no final conclusion about what a personality is or what constitutes a person's backdrop, like the genes, as you said. There's still a debate about every aspect of what drives human behavior. So when astrology when astrology gets into that territory of predicting people's emotions or behaviors, then by definition, it has to stay a little bit in that vague territory. It's not going to be understood by science clearly, because science itself doesn't understand those topics very clearly yet as well. So the
You mean
reason
mainstream science?
Right. Yes. There's all sorts of, schools of thought that actually capture much more wisdom and knowledge about these topics than what we see in the mainstream. So, which brings me to, why am I so focused on the mainstream? What's important about it? Why I think I keep track of what's happening in the mainstream, and it's a primary focus of mine, because it does affect how people think. And it like you gave a lot of examples about how you can't get through to society in a certain way if these systems in place are kind of resisting the ideas themselves. So it really limits, I would say, the evolution of our species, for the larger systems to have a certain mindset that's limiting or not open to these views. So that's why I'm always kind of monitoring and keeping track of that evolution and where things are going. That being said, one of the main, I have a project in mind that's why I reached out to you recently, where I'm envisioning a platform where astrologers can start to submit their observations, just purely observations about, the other day I saw a client, this was the transit, and this was what happened in correlation with that. It's a very strong correlation. It's a very clear kind of piece of data. I want to, have this published, or have this, like, let's accumulate this data so that we can synthesize it and come to conclusions about it. That's kind of the vision I have for a platform just online. And the good part about that is you can kind of bypass the whole funding question and money, because if you have a website and people have internet, you can start doing this kind of data accumulation and research. But what about the mainstream? That's kind of the tension I'm holding, and I'm curious what you think about the value of doing your own research in your own space. Maybe with a lot of astrologers, even, you can build a community and have your own scientific kind of understanding and use the scientific inquiry method in your own space. But what about the mainstream of science? What's going to happen with that? That's kind of the conflict I feel.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing in regard to what you're saying that we need to consider, and I don't have any necessary answers to it, is that, as a species, we are evolving. Now, taking evolution, the definition of evolution is Darwinian, basically, right? That, we started as, chimpanzee-like creatures, and chimpanzees are our closest relatives, and we evolved bipedalism. So we could walk on our hind legs. That gave us hands free, could move around more. We developed, tastes for different kinds of food. Um, the muzzle has been retracting. That's why we have problems with our wisdom teeth. So we're constantly evolving physically. Now we're also constantly evolving consciously, both as individuals, but mostly what I'm talking about here is collectively. And for, say, millions of years, it was more advantageous for human beings to remain in a tribe or a small group, and to protect themselves from outsiders who could bring in diseases or could kill them in some other way. So this is the basis of what might be called tribalism, right? So there are a lot of things like that go on all the time, and they play an important role. They when they work right, they lend themselves to the propagation of the species, and then sometimes they fall off and they're no longer valuable. Like right now, tribalism is a big problem, right? The idea that there is one dominant idea, like big science or the mainstream science, that tends to control everything, can be seen as an aspect or an element in the continuing evolution of human consciousness. And the question is, has that played a good role? Probably it has, because it got us to where we are now. And is it a problem now? Okay, that's a whole topic in itself. So we have to be careful about how we're judging things. And the world is how it is, largely as a result of how it was. And making something new is a very big deal. That's called an innovation. Okay. That being said, that there are these realities about our social systems that we shouldn't bang our heads against the wall for, because they're baked in, and it could take thousands, if not millions, of years to shift and change to something that's better, or more, or we could say better adapted to the environment, or better for the propagation of our species, or better for producing happiness among individuals. Okay. That being said, your idea about some kind of a network, an astrologers network that can collate information, I think this is important, but it should be preceded by a very clear understanding that we have to define astrology as a subject, and not just, when we say astrology, we can't say astrology in the same way we just say we're talking about science. There are different kinds of science. There are people doing great science that are way out there. Like, you ever hear of this guy, Dean Radin? Studies consciousness, right? I mean, he's doing good science as far as I can tell. He publishes papers. He's not going to get anywhere in the mainstream, but that's going on all the time. Now, in astrology, you say astrology and people immediately think of birth charts, and they call them horoscopes, which probably isn't even right. But the field of astrology actually can be seen very easily as a subject. And
could you define that?
Yeah, that a subject, let's take medicine. In medicine, you have it's the study of physical health and mental health. And you have history. There's a history of medicine. And then you have research. There's medical research all the time. And there's medical theories. There's theory about, we're in the, at a time when, germ theory is, still has a sway, and we're in, things like homeopathic medicine and natural medicine, Ayurvedic or Chinese medicine, or holistic medicine. That's the word I was looking for. They're there, they exist, but they're not particularly dominant. But they're different types, and but they have their own theories. So there's different theories. We're in allopathic medicine, I guess is probably the best word for it, right? So this is in the category of theory of medicine. And then there's the practice.
Yeah.
It's a separate thing.
Yeah.
A practice is not a science. It's a skill set. And it brings in a lot of things. Okay, so if we take astrology and look at it the same way, we have history of astrology, we got theory of astrology, we've got research in astrology, and then we have practice. So until we get that, wrap our heads around that, we're just going to confuse ourselves and confuse everybody else.
Would you agree, though, that it's always that back and forth kind of tension between practice and, well, in medicine, it would be clinical practice and research. In astrology, it would be, I guess, personal observations or, intuitive processes versus data.
It's all in the same subject. So practice is based on theory and research.
Right. So they both kind of feed into each other, even though they can't be perfect at all times. They always inform each other, is how you're viewing it.
They're all constantly developing.
Yeah.
if it was static, then what you have is like some of these, old natural medical models, like say traditional, Chinese medicine, for example, there are plenty of people that are trying to move that forward. I'm not saying that doesn't exist. It does. But there are also people that insist on practicing it one way, the old way. The old ways are the good ways. So that's static. And I think that we really want a little bit more than that. We want to progress because we're living in a different world now than when that particular form was developed. So that being said, there's plenty of room for astrology research, but it's got to be called that. And since we don't have in astrology units, or we can't get units very easily to test, which is how science works with units. You measure like something in units of feet or miles, and you measure units of energy and so on. You can work that way. But in astrology, it's hard to reduce, a Mars transit to a number. Or the influence of Mars in a chart. People try to do it, and there are some interesting approaches like astrodynes, for example. They're on most astrology programs, and they have a lot to do with the particular influence of a planet, largely due to how close it is to the Earth. But we can very easily create ways of doing research in regard to or along the lines of what you're suggesting by creating spreadsheets that organize observations, and then you can have people report them in, and the information can go into the proper part of the spreadsheet. And then over time, a database can be collected. Now, there's the big database. What's your name? Slips my mind. Shouldn't have, but anyway. So there's a big database of charts.
Something like Astrogenst, or
yeah, they actually hold it now. They hold it on to it's yeah, as you get old, you forget things. Anyway, it'll pop into my head in a minute. But anyway, so we have a database of natal charts, and they're organized according to different categories, people that are, in professions, and different professions, different medical conditions, and so on. And the charts are there. So that would be, an example for starting. And then you could break that into more subcategories. But you would have to look at you'd have to think about what people can tell you, and you'd have to figure how you can break that down and into categories so that when the information comes in, it could be placed in the right place and thus form a data set that can later be tested.
Right. There's a lot that needs to be agreed upon, including concepts and even terms of like, what can we really measure? What can we compare results of? Because if it's too much into the subjectivity realm, it's going to be difficult to do that, but we still want maybe behavior we can do. And then also even things like the house systems, everyone is using a different one pretty much. So we would have to agree on one so that we can have consistent results. So that's the way we can accumulate that data and make sense of it, kind of a thing. I'm wondering, let me put my thoughts together about what I was going to say.
Lois Rodden, by the way, is the name.
Oh, that's the one you were looking for. Okay, yeah. Yes. Do you see, like, have you felt the deficiency of not having that kind of a community in terms of, well, maybe you did. I mean, there are journals that are publishing data, research data on astrology, like correlation. Yeah. How much has that informed your practice? So I also want to kind of get a sense of your experience with, did you feel the need to get more data from others' experiences to inform your practice, or was it kind of good enough to have your observations? Like what was the need that you felt as you were practicing?
Well, as a practitioner, it was just building on experience. and learning and reading other astrologers' books and hearing other people talk. And I think I was always very active in the astrological community, particularly NCGR because it was very close to where I lived, the New York chapter, and there was a New Jersey chapter. And so that's a good group. Well, for me, it was a good group because a lot of people had interest in studying and making something of it. Particularly at the beginning, NCGR was a very scientific group. Um, but there was something that you said there I was going to respond to. I missed it. Okay.
I mentioned, the challenge of agreeing on concepts and like house systems, for example. That's one thing that's sticking to my mind. It has to be figured out.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I was going to give an example. And while I did learn a lot through observation and experience, there was a time where I was reading like 3 or 4 horoscopes charts a day, 4 or 5 days a week, 6 days a week sometimes. So I got a lot of experience in there. But there were a lot of things I wanted to test. And now one of them I'll give an example of is the idea that when somebody is born with a very hard moon Saturn aspect, that their very early childhood experiences were characterized by isolation, rejection, compartmentalization, um, deficiency, something like that. And I would love to have a database of at least 1,000 cases where, and then separated. You could have like moon square Saturn, moon conjunct Saturn. You could break it into aspects, and then you could have what the person experienced. Now, there was a time in the 40s and maybe even into the early 50s where infants were born, they were immediately thrown into an incubator. And it was more common then than it is now. And I ran into a lot of those charts, and every single one of them had a really sharp, hard moon Saturn aspect. And most of them couldn't really have a relationship because they really couldn't relate. They only felt, right. They only felt that the right way to feel was to be completely contained in themselves. And a lot of them had very difficult time expressing emotion. And I said to myself, wow, this would be a terrific astrology experiment. Later, people with moon Saturn, they weren't in incubators, but things would happen like their mother died when they were 1, or they were raised by their grandparents who, were a little distant from them. So what you could do is you could get a whole spreadsheet on moon Saturn aspects close. You could decide what your orbs you're using. And you'd always record the range. You would have like moon conjunct Saturn. Then you would have orb 0 to 3, orb 3 to 7, orb 7 to 15, say something like that. And then you would have the chart, the person's data. You would record that, and then some notes about maybe other categories, incubator, frequent changes. You could maybe have 10 or 15 categories of things that could happen to that person that would be moon Saturn. And you could just keep building on that until you got a lot of information. And then you would have something that could really be built into a respectable to the dominant form of science, respectable experiment, something that could be published somewhere.
And part of what's most exciting to me about that accumulation of data is that it will also help those who are practicing to discern more of what they're doing, because, you mentioned you can see the common pattern in what you're describing with the incubators and growing up with grandparents or being abandoned by a mother figure. There's that coldness in it, and we can associate that with the Saturn square transit. And then as we accumulate the data, we're going to start seeing new patterns and more detail about, so the incubator had this specific flavor to it, and that was associated with, let's say, a wider orb or whatever. We start to see more detail, and that's going to inform your practice, and you're going to start noticing more detail and patterns. So that's the kind of evolution and growth that excites me the most about, that kind of data accumulation as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think something like that needs to be done. It needs to be done right so that the information, acquired can be easily transferred into some kind of a study, and maybe even set up in ways that you can assign units. So, for example, in this case, the example I was making up, Sun conjunct Saturn, you have three categories for orb distance, right? And then you have, say, 12, 15 categories for the kinds of events that could occur. And maybe some of them could be personality nature, or you would have to bring in some psychology here and begin to understand a little bit more about how this plays out. And so, suppose somebody's born and they have like 5 or 6 of those things can be checked off.
Right.
They can be considered units. So, you can say that, that if you have, like, say, 1,000 examples of this, you could just take the ones that have more than 5 of those units. And so this would be an extreme sample. And one thing that I think we've learned in astrology is that extreme sampling, that is taking the cream of the crop, so to speak, is the best way to get, to see the results.
Could you say more about that last piece?
Well, Michel Gauquelin did probably the best astrology studies ever. And they're quite complex and well worth knowing about, but the most famous ones are with athletes. And what he found was that if you took a sample of athletes, and you ran them against, athletes of all abilities, of all levels, and you graphed their birth charts and saw where the planet Mars was, it would be all over the place. But if you took only the ones that have won national competitions, won gold medals at the Olympics, and so you just take the ones that are really, really good. And so now you have a smaller data set. You might have started with 1,000, now you're down to 100, but you have 100. And then there you see that, Mars is rising or Mars is culminating, or near rise or near culmination in those charts. So something is happening. That would be extreme sampling.
Right. So the stronger, to make the data stronger and more precise, you're willing to reduce the sample size as long as, you can kind of have it more clear and crisp. Am I understanding correctly?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. Well, would you like to share, if there's anything off the top of your head, which I assume there is, what some of those most crisp and clear observations, like you mentioned the Saturn transits, which I think you've studied a lot because you've also written about, as you said, I think it was your PhD thesis about weather and Saturn. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Either that or anything else from also, I would be interested in hearing about observations about psychology and personality traits in your practice. Are there kind of examples that stand out very strongly that you'll never forget about how precise and accurate astrology has proven to be in your experience?
Well, there's so many of them. I'm not sure quite how to answer that. I could say a few things about some of the things I've studied more closely. And recently I submitted an article, a paper to the NCGR journal, and it's on Venus. And Venus, as we understand it in Western astrology, is the planet of love and relationship and so on. But if you go to ancient Mexico, and I spent a lot of time studying ancient Mexican, I mean, this would include Maya, Aztec, Toltec, they're all very similar traditions. We know more about the Maya because there are inscriptions and so on, and a few surviving manuscripts. They thought Venus was male and had something to do with warfare.
Yes.
And when I first came across it, I said, wait a second, what's going on? It was associated with the myth of Quetzalcoatl. And so I dug more deeply into it and came to this realization that it really seemed that they perceived Venus on multiple levels, including agricultural, but in kind of a mythic level. And a level that has to do with society in general. They saw its cycle, its 584-day synodic cycle. Um, Easy way for an astrologer to think about it is from retrograde to retrograde, but it's, when Venus retrogrades, it's actually in conjunction with the sun. It's between the Earth and the sun. And in the middle of the retrograde period, that's where that occurs, and that's called the inferior conjunction. Right? But what the Maya saw was that throughout that whole 584 days from inferior conjunction to inferior conjunction, there were different effects. And so in this paper, I tested them out. I had been working on this for about 20, 30 years, really, and showed how there were these anecdotal correlations with events, news events, and so on. And you could see what was that there was a pretty strong and actually very striking correlation between a lot of things, but you couldn't put your finger on it because you couldn't put a unit on these things. You can't measure them. So the Maya always thought that, and the Aztecs too, that at the inferior conjunction, people could be struck down, that there would be some kind of striking mechanism that would level people. So I started looking at things like aviation crashes, downfall of leaders, political coups, things like that. And what I found was a database on Wikipedia of about 450, 500 some aviation disasters of over 50 people killed.
Oh.
I said to myself, here's some extreme sampling and a lot of it.
Mm-hmm.
So what I did was I broke down the Venus 584-day synodic cycle into little 15-day components. And it would start at the inferior conjunction and so on. And then I looked at all these, and then I put that on a spreadsheet horizontally. And then what I did was I took all these plane crashes and put them in where it was appropriate. And lo and behold, a pattern came out. It does seem that it's a little more dangerous, so to speak, at the inferior conjunction. But what was the most striking was when you get to the opposite, the superior conjunction, the number of crashes goes way down. It follows the cycle of the planet perfectly. And so I have it written up and I have some nice graphs on it and everything.
Yeah.
But what it says to me is that something's going on here. And most of these crashes, in fact, probably all of them are related to human error of some sort. You're making bad judgments.
Uh-huh.
Right? So there's a psychology in there. To me, this is an opening to a lot of other insights into what may be going on to humans as the planets go through these different motions. In this case, it's Venus. It doesn't have to do with anything that we think about Venus.
Right.
This is something very different, but the correlation is very strong, particularly at the superior conjunction. So now we have something else going on here. Maybe there's some kind of disruption in the human mind.
They're distracted by something. And
there's a distraction that the balance is not maintained, right? So there may be a very Venusian factor at work. So what I need now is another data set of something that has to do with balance, or maybe not, and then run that against it.
I'm curious, does it have anything to do with the sign that Venus is in, or is that
I completely omitted the signs. I mention it because the conjunctions will, occur at 5 points in the zodiac, forming that 5-point star, and then they retrograde in the zodiac over time, very slowly.
Yeah,
I mentioned that, but I didn't focus in on it. The one thing when you're doing a scientific experiment like this, it is better to stick with as few things as possible to start with.
Right, to lay that foundation, and then you can get into more detail. And so do you have also something that has to do maybe with your client base that where personality patterns or psychology, that's also something I was curious about. What sticks out right now in your thinking as like, wow, astrology is really good at predicting or seeing this with this transit, for example?
Yeah, well, I mean, you could look at the politics going on right now. Biden, for example, has Saturn right at his IC, which is the perfect time to step down.
Mm.
And Harris has Saturn going through her 10th house, which is the time to step up.
The lunar eclipse is also going to be in her 10th house, which next Tuesday, I believe it is. That's also in Pisces, 25 degrees, I think. Yes. So did you, well, give me, I'd love to hear more examples. Anything from, I love the incubation and the rejection piece. Anything more about Venus or Mars, the personal planets that, like, when you think of those planets and their placements, I feel like you have a repertoire of knowledge about those things, and I want to kind of bring it out and hear about it, basically.
Well, here's something juicy. There's I did a lot of relationship analysis in my career, and I learned a lot about people and how they're attracted to each other and whatnot. And I kind of came up with this model that involves Mars, Venus, Moon, Ascendant, and that the chemistry. I mean, there's you can have a relationship with somebody and it can be very balanced, but if the chemistry is not there, you're not likely to mate. Or do any of the business associated with mating. However, you can have people that are just drawn to each other chemically and have nothing in common, and so they have no compatibility. And this was something that I was always very concerned with, because I would have these clients that would just come to me one after the other with somebody that they met that they were just hot for, but had no compatibility. And I can remember, giving advice. Well, you really shouldn't get married with this. And almost always I was right. It would be a disaster. They would divorce 2 months later or something. What I found was that between two charts, Mars Moon, Mars Ascendant, and Mars Venus are by far the hottest. I mean, there are lots of other things going on. You could talk about Pluto and Uranus and all that, but those 4 points are just tremendous. You get somebody with their Mars conjunct your Ascendant, there's going to be a signal, unless there's something else going on, like Saturn's in the way or something like that. Mars Moon, very hot. And of course, Mars Venus. So I wrote an article. One of the first articles I ever wrote for the Mountain Astrologer back in the early 90s was called, I think I called it Street Smart Astrology. That if you really wanted to, hook up, that's what you needed to look at.
Okay, Mars, Venus, Ascendant, and Moon.
I tried to get a program that would do that and more. It would do other things as well for many years in the 90s, and I couldn't get anybody to do it, and I didn't have the time to learn how to do the programming myself.
You have a calculator on your website. Could you tell me more about that?
Yeah, that's the website. My friend Barry actually did a lot of the computer stuff, and I did more of the content. But we were both and are both interested in Mesoamerican astrology, and I just talked about the Venus side of it. But the key component of Mesoamerican astrology are what are called the day signs. They're like every day, there's like a 20-day pattern, and every day has its own psychology. And I got deeply involved in this for a long time and became convinced that it actually worked. And Barry built this little computer program to calculate, the sign. And Astrolabe also has a much more extensive program where you can actually get what's called a Mesoamerican horoscope, which I invented based on synodic cycles. It's called Mayan life path astrology. And there's some people that really follow that. Every once in a while, I, have some kind of contact with people that are using it. So you can go and figure your day sign. Now, we were like among the first, probably possibly even the first to do that. But now there are many, many day sign calculators online, but you have to be careful because there's some people that have their own ideas and they have correlations that are a little wacky or a little off base. I use what's called the Goodman-Martinez-Thompson correlation, which I found to be more effective and correlate better with my observations. It's known as the GMT correlation. But there are followers there was a guy named Jose Arguez, He was the kind of the godfather behind the harmonic convergence in this. I guess it was in the 70s, right? No, the 80s. That's a long time ago. Yeah. Do you remember
Is
that?
harmonic convergence is a part of harmonic astrology, or is
No, it
that
was an
not?
event. It was like a worldwide event.
Oh, it's an event. Okay, I did not know about that.
Yeah, so let's see. It was based on Mayan astrology. So if we got 2012 was the big year, right? So if we go minus 25,
Right.
it was 1987. That's right. It was
Uh-huh.
1987. Yeah. And so he was very big at that time with Mesoamerican ideas. And I thought he was a little off base on a lot of this. He was more of a kind of a charismatic artist. And I've always been more of a science oriented, let's get to the facts kind of thing. So I did a lot of reading on Maya archaeology and what we knew about their calendars and gave a lot of thought to that.
I see. Which reminds me, I had a question that I didn't get to about the Venus being seen as a male planet. Um, were there also cultures that associated Venus with war, but saw it as a female planet? Am I remembering correctly?
Well, in the Western tradition, you can find, Venus was divided into Lucifer and Hesperus, Lucifer being the morning star and Hesperus the evening star. And in Mexico, Quetzalcoatl was the morning star and Xoloth was the evening star. So both cultures saw differences there at different names, but they knew that it was the same body.
Mm-hmm.
Venus Lucifer is kind of striking and more aggressive, and that tends to be true. If you look at people born at the inferior conjunction, now that would mean that they have the Sun conjunct Venus and Venus is retrograde,
Right.
or even a few couple months after that time, their Venus tends to be a little bit more headstrong
Hmm.
and impulsive. Um, but if you look at the corresponding Western side, they're far more conservative and traditional.
Huh.
Other things being equal.
Okay. Great. So there's so much that, I could get into, but I'm going to try to stay with the topic that we started out with, which is the title of our video here is The Future of Science and Astrology. And given your moon in Aquarius and the fact that Pluto is finishing up its time in Capricorn as we speak, November 19th, I think it's going to move into Aquarius for good. What do you see as the future of, the relationship between science and astrology? I spoke to you about feeling relatively optimistic that at least we can do the type of thing we've been talking about, like building a well-knit community where information can be shared and there can be this mutual growth and evolution based on the coming together of observations. So it's like creating our own scientific community. I see that as very possible. What do you think about the future and where astrology will be in society?
Well, I think until astrology organizes itself as a subject, it's going to kind of just spin around in a circle and not get anywhere. But I'm hopeful because I see more and more people like yourself that are, that see a need to get a little more focused and precise about what it is that we're doing. It's a great challenge. Astrology has got a lot of baggage. It's been around for a long time. It attracts people that don't necessarily cooperate all that well with each other and kind of want to have it their own way and do their own thing. There are uh, kinds of astrology that are extremely traditional and don't want to budge on that. And, so it's a mixed bag, bringing everybody together in astrology is quite a chore. We do have periodically the United Astrology Conference, and I believe there's another one that's been planned. They went on for a while in the 70s and 80s and 90s, 80s and 90s. And
That's the one that
yeah,
happens every 4 years or so, was
it
it?
happens when they can get a committee together that can actually put it on. And the people that
Mhm.
did the original ones are too old to do it now. But that was good because it brought a lot of people together and a lot of different traditions. But astrology has had one big problem, and that's survival. And when you're just trying to survive as a discipline, you really don't have the luxury of doing a lot of other things. Astrology exists in a hostile environment intellectually. And you have people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who I respect, has a lot of good things to say, but he dumps on astrology now and then. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And as I mentioned before, very, very few people I met in science were clear about that. And Lynn Margulis was an example. She could spot, basically she could spot bullshit right away, immediately, and know when people didn't know what they were talking about. And if you were in her class, and she never had exams, you had to give presentations. There were like 3 presentations during the class and a bunch of paper assignments. And if you would go up there and you would say something, she would interrupt you and say, "Oh, tell me about what you're talking about. How do you know this?" And she would expose people in front of the whole class as to not knowing making an assumption and not knowing what they're talking about. So anyway, the astrology has been living in an intellectual environment that's been dominated by powerful people who make assumptions. And the best we can do is change that by us not making assumptions and actually trying to build knowledge on some kind of solid basis, and be very clear that astrology research is not astrology practice, and vice versa.
Yes. So could you say more about that? You mentioned at the beginning as well that what's crucial is that astrology becomes a subject. Could you say more about how that would be and what you would want to see for that to happen?
I think that it's moving in that direction anyway. We have today, better than ever before, people working on the history of astrology. We have people that get, doctorates in the history of astrology, and so we know more about our history than most subjects actually at this point. The research, there is research, more needs to be done. There is no funding, or very little. But it can, I suggested ways that it can be done, and I've done a little bit of it myself. You ever hear that line, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? And then the follow up to that is they also require extraordinary funding.
Yes.
Astrology is in no position to do the kind of science work that is needed to move it up to the level of psychology or some other social science, because we have no funding. We don't have strong institutions. Right. We barely have institutions. We have a few organizations and a few schools, and that's about it. Mm-hmm. So, but the people are working on it, and it just needs to be clarified. Oh, sorry about this. Let me see if I could shut this off. Do that. How come it's not? Oh, here it is. Might want to cut that out in the talk here. Edit that out, huh? Sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah. Where was I? Before I was interrupted by my own phone. I usually know to shut it off, but I didn't.
You were saying that we're nowhere near having the level of funding we would need to get to the level of psychology, for example.
Yeah, we don't have that. We have weak institutions. We have the beginnings of institutions, so it's not all bad. But we also need more work on theory. We need somebody or some group to start working on putting ideas together. What are the leading theories in astrology? What do we know and what we don't know? Because it's the theories that direct research. It's the theories that point us in directions that can allow for the creation of more knowledge. Yeah, basically, research and theory is how you make knowledge about astrology. And astrology, up until this point, has mostly been based on tradition. The knowledge was made by observation. It's been written down, and then we just use it.
Hmm. I would assume that, if there's an intention and a drive to do the research, then the theory will kind of also go hand in hand. People will feel the need to uh, revitalize and also kind of revamp the theory. But I'm also, can we make the distinction between what I said earlier about like creating a platform where there's free exchange of information and being able to accumulate data, and there's kind of less resistance to that idea because of the question of funding and money. What do you see, like what kinds of research would be able to be done with funding that would otherwise not be able to be done?
You
That's
would
a very
collect data. You would collect data. There was some hope for a while about getting data from the usage on the internet. Some people have done studies on that, but now that data is being sold. It's being controlled and sold. So collecting data is all about it. Here's something that I learned. I was in geosciences. My degree is in geosciences. I would say that 95% of the people working in geosciences at the University of Massachusetts, and I'm sure it's the same everywhere else, were dedicated to ways to produce data. How do you get data? And then after that, you start working with the data. But the production of data is absolutely crucial. And with astrology, it's hard to do.
The body of data that you mentioned earlier, was that astrological data, or were you talking in general about some research data?
Oh,
the one that you said that there's this data that you can only get with money. Is there a specific set of data?
No, it's the construction, the production of data.
You're talking
so
general.
Suppose you want to do something like a study of outcomes of a particular surgery.
Mm-hmm.
Or one study that I've wanted to do for a long time would be a study of data recorded at veterinary hospitals. And the way I would do that study I would get like 100 veterinary hospitals, and I would have them record the number of wounded animals coming in a day.
Yeah.
From accidents. I would specify, say, accidents, and have 10 years of that from 100 places. And then I would run that against like the full moon. I would run it against Mars, Saturn, or whatever else. Another version of that might be, like shootings. We just had a shooting, was Mars Neptune square. I think there's a pretty strong correlation between mass shootings and Mars and Pluto, Mars and Neptune, things like that, Mars and Uranus. But you would need a lot of data. So somebody's got to do it. Yeah. And in order to do a study properly, you need hundreds of cases. It's the sample size can't be ignored. A lot of medical products get pushed onto the market, and the sample size is so small, it's ridiculous. They get away with it because people want medicine. People aren't clamoring for astrology. There's no great need for astrology. In fact, a lot of people don't want it because they perceive it as fatalistic, which it is in their own mind, but it's hardly as fatalistic as genetics or childhood upbringing. That's the real fate. Astrology is a more subtle version of predispositions. But anyway, the collection of data is time consuming and consequently costly.
So you gave a few examples of like being able to obtain data from, let's say, hospital records or veterinary and that kind of thing. Other than that, what else would funding be needed for? Because I'm trying to like cover all of the bases of what astrology would want to research, and then get a sense of how we're limited by the lack of the collective belief systems and not having funding.
Well, I wouldn't worry too much about the collective belief systems. I would just worry about doing a proper experiment. And a proper experiment needs a large sample size, and it needs somebody that knows what to do with it. And the collection of the data is the biggest problem, and that's time. So, do I have time to be in touch with 100 veterinary offices and constantly remind them to send me their data on a spreadsheet?
Right.
And that to find out that half of them decide after a year they don't want to participate anymore because it's a pain in the ass.
Hmm.
I mean, that's the unfortunate reality. And a person collecting data has to go through a lot. And in the academic world, suppose you're doing a psychology study and you're trying to collect data. You you may be doing it as a postdoc for your advisor or for somebody in the school there, and so you have a salary. So you're getting paid. You're getting paid a small salary, so you're living on it. Your job is to get data. We don't have that.
Right. So it would be fair to say, though, that, excuse me, as long as the data that we are getting is publicly available, there's no real resistance to doing the kind of research that you would see as solid and good research.
Yeah, I mean, I think very solid research can be done in astrology. Gauquelin did it, and he did it a long time ago, and he did it before computers. So I mean, that guy was astrology's genius of the 20th century in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be done, and it can be done a lot easier now because of the interconnectedness of the electronics. But somebody's got to do it.
It does take a lot of work still and energy. Yes.
Yeah, I don't have the time for it. I have 5 or 6 studies that I want to do, and I have
Oh,
files on them, and I have data, that some of them are weather related, and I just say I got to take off a whole week just to get the database right, and it makes my head hurt because you're just crunching numbers, and you get these databases that are filling up like 250,000 cells, and then the software itself is shaking when you're saving it or changing it or something, or converting it. So you have to know what you're doing,
yeah.
and to get this done. And then I have the results, and then you look at the results and you make a graph, and then you try to model it a little bit, and then you make a prediction and you test it. Then once you've done that, you go, well, this is how I do it, at least. Once I have a sense that something's going on, then I have to do all the controls. So for every experiment, you might want to have, a half dozen or a dozen controls just to
Mm-hmm.
show that this is not, a freak situation. So there's
Mm-hmm.
more time.
Yes. Do
Science
you
is
want to?
incredibly boring, the main part of it.
Right, that part can be just work. Would you mind sharing a little bit about what your studies are about?
Well, I'm continuing with the Venus study. I have a study on Jupiter and rainfall.
Oh,
And I
again,
have
not dependent on any sign, Jupiter in general.
beg your
With
pardon?
the rain, Jupiter not dependent on any zodiac sign again, right? This is just Jupiter with rainfall.
Yeah, Jupiter relative to the planets.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the way I use the zodiac, or have been using the zodiac in these studies that I do, is actually the relationship of the planetary position to the equinoxes and solstices,
Hmm.
rather than the zodiac itself.
Okay.
Um, I could look at the zodiac, but I have to draw a line somewhere. And I started this study of planets and weather as a result of reading uh, some writings by Johannes Kepler. That's how
Mm-hmm.
what I did my PhD. My PhD thesis was basically looking at Kepler and then what he said about astrometeorology, and then I tested it in modern times.
Oh, okay. Um, you were
So the
saying,
title was a history and test of planetary weather forecasting.
wow. So was it all the planets that he had a theory about how they affect weather, or specific ones?
Well, the ones that they knew at the time,
Okay, of course.
7
Yeah.
planets.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you
So,
count the sun and moon as planets.
mm-hmm. Great. Okay, so you were telling us about your study. So there's the Jupiter and rainfall one. Anything else? And the Venus?
Yeah, I have a one that I come to periodically about. I look at the population of Democrats and Republicans in the Senate and House over time, and I have that correlated to the planet Mars. But I'm not
Uh-huh.
done with that one yet. There's some interesting correlations, but I come back to that now and then.
So
Usually
which
about
one
every
is
2 years when there's an election.
which one is more correlated with Mars?
Republicans.
Yeah, that's what I would have guessed.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's the Mars, fraternity there.
Okay. Great. Well,
Fight, fight, fight.
I don't want to keep you too much longer since also you're not feeling that well today. Thank you again for taking the time. Is there anything that you would want to say kind of as like a final message about this topic or word of advice, however you want to see it?
Well, I just
You
think
wrap it
that
up.
I really think the most important thing I have to say is that we need to be thinking of astrology as a subject.
Yes.
We really need to make that distinction because we throw out the word astrology to somebody and they immediately have a reaction because they think they know what it is and they generally don't like it.
I want to clarify this, but also for the viewers, could you like astrology as a subject versus what?
Well, when you say the word astrology, what do you mean? When you
Is
go
it
up to somebody in the street and you say astrology, they're going to have a very superficial understanding of it.
the horoscope column in the
Yeah.
magazine or
I mean,
something?
you
Yeah.
could say the same is true about medicine. I mean, when the COVID thing happened, I had a lot of exchanges on social media with people that thought, doctors were scientists.
Hmm.
And I tried to say, well, not really. I mean, certainly there's some doctors
Not
who
all
are
of them.
scientists, right?
Right.
But for the most part, they're not. They're practitioners. They're trying to help people. The scientists are doing something else.
Right.
So we need in astrology to be ahead of the game on that and just say, okay, we have, we're dividing our subject into categories, and astrology as a practice is one thing, but astrology, people have, just to jump ahead, most people have no idea that there's research in astrology and that there are theories of astrology.
Right.
They're clueless about it, and this is the best way to let them know, by defining astrology as a subject, like any other subject. Every other subjects do the same thing. Why should astrology be any different?
So astrology is a subject that has different kind of categories to it and kind of areas of study to it. Is that a correct description
Yeah, I think the
of
best
the subject?
comparison would be to medicine or psychology.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in psychology, you major in psychology, but you're not a practitioner.
Mm-hmm.
That's therapy.
Right.
That's completely different.
There's the theory, there's the research, there's the practice.
Yeah,
Okay, I think I get it now.
yeah.
Okay.
And history. Don't forget history.
And history. Yes. And you're
And
right.
and you could add philosophy too.
Right. We do get a lot of background information about the history of astrology, and it really informs what you know about astrology. It's kind of a crucial part of the education, as you were saying. So, okay, that's the takeaway message that you want to give me and us, whoever is watching, about the crucial point is we need to kind of, for astrology to be as valid and legitimate as it possibly can be, we as a community have to also define it accurately as a field that has different aspects to it, just like any other field like medicine, and to keep those categories distinct from each other and to then be able to communicate between those categories.
I think that would make astrology a bit more respectable, and it
Mm-hmm.
would move it. And as I was mentioning earlier about the importance of respect in human
Respect.
behavior, right? And this
Yeah.
this would move astrology a little more closely to maybe getting some recognition and getting some funding.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically, it's reality. I mean, this is, I'm not making anything up. This is how it really is. The
Mm-hmm.
fantasy is that astrology is some kind of magical discipline that, like somebody can just learn a little bit about it and suddenly they're an astrologer, and and they can make a prediction, and they happen to know somebody who's a publisher of a magazine, and the next thing you know, they're all over the place. I mean, that's a ridiculous situation.
Right.
Astrology needs to be better represented, and the only way that's going to happen is to define the subject better.
Right. The it's interesting because astrology can, because it also includes a very intuitive process. Sometimes people use astrology just as like a language to make psychic predictions, and they just kind of,
Astrology as a practice
yeah.
includes people that have intuitive qualities.
Thank you. Astrology as a practice, yes, includes people with intuitive capacities, and they use those skills in their sessions. Um, that I won't. I feel like this discussion will not be complete until I ask you about that. What does Bruce Scofield think of when you mention magic? You do have, you said, a strong Uranus in your chart, so I can't imagine you not having a metaphysical side to you, even though you're very on the ground scientifically oriented and, you know, data driven in your thinking. Do you have anything you'd like to share as a kind of a closing inspirational speech about what kind of magical things are intriguing to you in terms of, you know, how reality works or how astrology works?
Yeah, well, we do know that yesterday's magic is today's science. So I mean,
Yes.
it's an ongoing kind of thing. And I would say that I came up through with a lot of theosophy and Hermeticism and Hinduism and Taoism, and today my mindset is probably best described as mostly Stoic and Taoist. It's kind of the way
Really?
I think, So I do have that kind of metaphysical training that goes on all the time. Um, but as far as the magic side of astrology, oh, here goes the dehumidifier. Noise is all over down here. Yeah. If I was upstairs, there would be people coming and going, so you can't win.
I can't hear it, so.
Yeah, okay, it's pretty loud here. Anyway, the whole idea of astrology as magic, I don't think is very helpful. Um, I think it's just better to say that that the astrological effect is still something to be determined.
Mm-hmm.
We don't really know that much about it. But we could have a hypothesis, about how it works. Magic doesn't explain anything. It's just, if you take it in terms of natural magic,
Yes, I think
right?
that's what I mean.
then we're talking about um, influence and the power of suggestion and the power of the mind, and we're into the field of consciousness now, and how
Mm-hmm.
consciousness can manipulate reality. But I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that that's necessarily a promising direction to go with in astrology. I think that should be taken on its own terms, and then maybe later can be applied to astrology or looked at. But um, I really think that we as astrologers should be concerned with improving our ability to interpret the symbolism, improving um, our understanding of what we're doing, making the distinction between practice and research and theory and so on, that that we're really in a subject that's a lot bigger than just reading somebody's chart, and appreciating the fact that there are a lot of things in nature that we don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And I think every science is in that position. Um,
Yep.
and the practitioners really don't need to be concerned too much with that. Practitioners should just practice. They should just learn and get better at what they do. They don't need to do a lot of speculation and say, well, it's magic, how it's working. Move that to the theory of astrology department and then see what they do with it.
Right. And as you said, when I say magic, I don't mean something that's illogical or chaotic. It's more what science has not yet described, kind of supernatural or subtle level processes that haven't yet seeped into the mainstream consciousness is really how I see magic. It's just, certain things happen, but we haven't yet come to a satisfactory understanding or description of it. That's what I call magic. And to your earlier point about causation, I love to just keep things at the level of correlation and just say, this is parallel with that. Like that when this happens, that's happening, because I don't think we know more than that either. And as you said, we can use symbolism that's where a little bit of the magic comes in, I think, though, just as a parenthesis. Symbolism itself is kind of an otherworldly almost kind of we use ideas about the planet or archetypes or symbols associated with the planet, and we draw meaning from that to describe what's actually happening in physical reality. So that, for example, I think is magic only in terms of to a regular scientifically minded person in today's modern world, that would be a little cuckoo.
Well, still, everything that you said would be in the category of theory of astrology.
Yeah.
That these are very interesting discussions and very important. And if I get what you're saying correctly, it's okay to say we don't know what's going on. We recognize a correlation and we're working with that. And that's how science starts.
Mm-hmm.
All science begins with correlation. And
Yep.
and then then you get into testing, and then you get into mathematical modeling if it's possible in your science. But there's plenty of sciences where that's not possible.
Yes.
Anthropology, for example, or even psychology. There's so much in psychology that's not
Psychology is
reduce.
very
You can't
difficult.
reduce it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
At least in today's, where things are at today. I do envision a future where we'll be able to detect thought forms with physical devices and so on and so forth. I think it's still possible in my lifetime. We'll see. But yeah,
Didn't Annie Besant do that with the Theosophical Society?
I heard of him. I know
Or
about
her,
but or is it her? Who it was? Andy?
Annie Besant. Maybe it
Annie.
was. Maybe it wasn't her, but there were people that were photographing thought forms and publishing them about 100 years ago.
Right. And that, what you were saying about like these things are all over the place. It's just about the mainstream not talking about it. Yes. For it to come into the mainstream like medical field, that's kind of the vision that I've always had. I don't know if it's possible, but um
It
if we
is.
come
I think it's very possible.
yeah, if we come to that place, then things that were not able to be studied so far will become, it's going to be a whole new world. And I look forward to that. But I'm very glad to hear that you're optimistic as well. Thank you for
Yeah,
this.
I think there's things look good. I think the next generations coming up are pretty sharp, and they have the benefit of a lot of work being done on astrology over the 20th century. 20th century was basically sorting through a lot of the past
Mhm.
and pulling it out, and even up until the present. So the younger generations are going to get a lot more information, and it'll be in a better form. But
Yeah,
just but there's got to be this association of astrology with one thing is not a good idea. It's got to be broken down into segments, into
uh-huh.
pieces. Otherwise, you're not going to make any progress, and it's going to be chaotic.
I note taken. That's very important in the way that you see things, and that's good to know because um yeah, the clarity is difficult to maintain, and it's in a topic like astrology when you're talking about the physical and non-physical things at once, and it's all intertwined with each other. So keeping at least what you can distinct from each other. I think that's what I'm getting from what you're saying, to just have this structure in place so that you can at least, do all of that intuitive thinking within that paradigm.
Yeah, you know what you're doing, and you exercise critical thinking where necessary, and you
Right.
exercise intuition where needed. You
Mhm.
know when to use what tool.
Very important.
And some people have both tools, and some people are real good at one and not at the other, and vice versa.
Hmm.
There's room for everybody in astrology. I mean, astrological research certainly doesn't require too much intuition. It requires a lot of patience and insight and the ability to analyze data. It's a different part of the mind.
Yeah. Well, thank
Let's
you
hope
very
for the
much.
best.
Yes. To be continued, hopefully. Thank you
Yeah.
so much, Bruce, for
You're welcome.
joining
Nice
me.
speaking with you, Ferda.
Nice speaking with you. Bye.
Edit out that part where the phone was ringing. Forgot all about
This
that.
was a live stream, so people are going to see it, but I don't think it's just a part of our journey
Oh,
here.
okay. All right.
Thank you.
Whatever. All right. Bye-bye.